Ladies and gents, my name is Brandon Stover. Welcome to the How to Solve Climate Change course from Plato University. Causes, systems, obstacles, solutions to this global challenge is what you're going to learn here today. When you're ready to learn more skills, join us for free at plato.university. Let's get started with today's lesson. We'll have our expert guests briefly introduce themselves and their credentials for why they are able to speak to this topic.
I'm Karen Hardee, and I'm the president of Hardee Associates, so currently consulting, and my whole career, I've been working in family planning and reproductive health and population and development, and more recently, climate change. And I have a PhD from Cornell University's International Population Program in their Department of Development Sociology. So I call myself a social demographer. So always been interested in the intersection between gender, culture, population, societies, and health programming. And as I said, more recently, climate change. And I got interested in the topic of population and climate change when I was working at an organization called Population Action International, and we got funding from a donor to look at the links between population and climate change. So I had the great fortune of working with a really world-class demographer, Dr. Lei-Wen Jiang, who was at the time doing sort of the population parts of climate models. So really learned a lot from him and collaborated with him.
When we speak of population, can you explain succinctly what population is from first principle?
Yes, population is a funny word because it's just a group of something that we're interested in. But for here, we're talking about human population. So we can think about the population of a country, for example, and adding up the populations of all the countries, we get to the world population. So populations can change in three ways. It's actually pretty simple. There are births, which we talk about fertility and number of children. There are, of course, deaths. We talk about mortality and, when people die, how many people die. And we talk about migration, both moving within a country, but moving also outside of countries. But of course, then we can disaggregate all of those things by a lot of different factors. For example, sex, male, female, genders, age, whether people live in cities, towns, or rural areas, socioeconomic factors. So there are a lot of ways that we can use those data on births, deaths, and migration. I think you've probably heard that the world's population just reached 8 billion. And we're currently adding, what people don't always realize is we're currently adding 80 million people a year to the world's population. So that's the equivalent of 10 New York cities, or maybe the country of Germany. Every year we're adding to the world's population. So while the world's population is still growing, although this year it's under 1% growth, it's such a big base that even 1% growth on 8 billion people is still a lot of growth. But we have this issue now where we have some countries, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, that are still growing quite rapidly with high fertility rates. But we're also hearing in a lot of other places in the world, including, we've heard about Japan for many years, but most recently China, which was concerned about its population earlier, but now all of a sudden is considered to have an aging population. So there's sort of a bit of an unbalance in the world's population of rapidly growing and then rapidly aging places. So it's very, very interesting. But the United Nations suggests that the world's population the United Nations has a population division that does these statistics, and it's estimating that the world will be about 9.7 billion by 2050 and about a little over 10 billion by the year 2100. But that's considered the median variant projection. The UN does three projections. They do a high variant, medium variant, and low variant population projection. And the difference in that, which is so interesting, people don't realize also, is half a child. So for example, so half a child more from the median variant gets you to the high variant, and half a child less gets you to the low variant. And in 2021, the world's average birth rate stood at 2.3 births per woman. And that's down from 5 births per woman in 1950. So really huge declines in fertility in the world. And it's projected to be more like 2.1 births per child in 2050.
Why might population impede us from creating solutions or overcoming climate change?
So it's really important to understand how population is situated in the science around climate change and in the discourse around climate change, and to avoid drawing simplistic conclusions about it, and to differentiate the science from the politics. Because you can imagine, think about the dimensions of population that I just talked about: births, deaths, and migration. We can add all of those things, that's pretty straightforward, but they all have social implications. And so that, as you can imagine, there are huge sensitivities around, maybe not so much about mortality, but around fertility and migration. As we know, there are huge sensitivities. So the easiest way to think about population and climate change is that population is a variable in climate models. So we have to think about it. And the best way to think about it is through the IPAT equation. And this was something that was developed in the 1970s to look at our environmental impact. And that, to say, is that the human impact on greenhouse gas emissions is a function of population. So there's our population variable, and sort of affluence, the GDP, gross domestic product per capita, and also technology, or the impact per unit of consumption. And that IPAT equation is really, it's sort of at the center of a lot of climate modeling. It's, much more sophisticated uses of it, but it sort of boils down to that. It gets very complicated very quickly, and you have to. So the models that the climate scientists do have to look at all of those factors. And when one goes up, what happens to the others? And so it really is trying to look at what is the impact of population in these models, depending on the assumptions that you put in. But we know, I think that most of the attention in looking at climate change has been on energy efficient technologies, which is the energy efficiency part of the Chi identity, and also renewable energy, carbon storage, and nuclear energy, which is the carbon efficiency piece of it. So, okay, so that's sort of what most people think of when you think of like doing something about climate change. So what about population? The early studies on population, basically, controlling for some other factors, basically showed that a 1% increase in population growth was associated with a 1% increase in carbon emissions. So that was sort of the first looking at the relationship. But the studies since then, that was probably in 1990, the studies since then have become far more complex and sophisticated, because those early studies just sort of assumed an average consumption of all people in a group. And we know that, that's just simply not true. So urbanization makes a difference, age structure makes a difference, numbers of people in a household make a difference. So it turns out, not surprisingly, that there are, very significant differences among groups, both between populations, but also within populations, within countries. So it's the issue with population is that the areas with low population growth, which is the high income countries, of course, have huge, much higher rates of emission, per capita emissions, than the countries with the high population growth, which is sub-Saharan Africa, and there are some other countries in Asia, for example. So that's been the huge sensitivity about population, trying to address population in climate change, because it makes it sound like you're saying, oh well, if people in sub-Saharan Africa just have fewer children, we'll solve climate change, and which is absolutely not the case. Nobody's really saying that, but you can imagine it sort of gets people's sort of hackles up when you start talking about it, and because the Project Drawdown, which is a group that's looking for practical solutions to address climate change. They say, 10% of people globally, it generate almost half of the consumption-related emissions, while the areas of Africa, the continent of Africa, they're responsible over time for about 4% of global emissions. But okay, so with that said, addressing population in the long run does make a difference in these climate models. Some colleagues, my colleague Lewin Zhang and his colleague Brian O'Neill and others have done very sophisticated sort of population modeling in climate models, and really have found that that it won't make a difference in the short run because demographics are they're hard to change in the very short term. But in the long term, they said that if the world takes the low path of the population projections, that could reduce global emissions by 15% by 2050 and 40 to 60% by 2021. So really, quite a significant difference. And part of that is because people in the global south, where population is growing, their sort of consumption levels of consumption now are actually quite low compared to the high income countries, of course, but nobody wants them to stay at those levels of consumption. So as their populations grow and their consumption increases, that's sort of what makes the difference. So going on the lower path of population growth would be helpful.
How might we mitigate or eliminate some of the obstacles that population presents for climate solutions?
So the best thing really is to invest in quality education and what we call human rights-based family planning, with no coercion, not in any case saying to women, you can only have this many children. Or, I mean, what's happening now in countries with low fertility is there's just this sort of like, oh my goodness, the world is imploding. There aren't enough people in the world. Have more babies. So they're sort of that's sort of called pronatalist coercion, which is just as bad as sort of coercion of telling people that they can only have a certain number of children. So, but what we found again is any kind of coercive program is absolutely not necessary if you just give people the choice, give them the autonomy to make those decisions, that they make the right decisions. So that's really the first. But the issue is, because it's so sensitive, it's not included in discussions in climate change when the party convention of parties that you've probably heard of. There's one in Scotland. I think there's something coming up in Egypt. There's the Paris Agreement, Copenhagen. You're probably hearing about some of these climate meetings. Population is just the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to take it on because they say it's just too sensitive. And if we do, we just get criticized. So we need to look at the factors that are in climate, in sort of the drivers of climate. There's an international panel on climate change, which is the IPCC, which is a group of world scientists from around the world, and they put out periodic assessment reports. And the latest assessment report was from number 6, just came out a couple of years ago, and they said this was in the body of the scientific report. Globally, GDP per capita and population growth remain the strongest drivers of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion in the last decade. And they said that those two things dwarfed any improvements in the reduction in the use of energy per unit of GDP, which is another one of those terms, and then as well as improvements in the carbon intensity of energy. So scientists just a couple of years ago saying population is still a really important factor. But that was in the body of the report, which is, probably thousands of pages, you have to find it. It did not make it into the summary that goes to policymakers. So it just gets buried, unfortunately.
What are some of the best resources to learn more about population in relation to climate change?
I would say looking at Project Drawdown, an initiative that brings to bear the sort of the best scientific evidence of solutions. So again, a couple of years ago, Project Drawdown, and they have a website that listeners can find. Sort of updated the information on the evidence on 93 solutions, and what they found in that is that family planning and education, particularly girls' education, was in the top 10 of these climate solutions. So again, really good evidence there, and really interesting website. You can sort of play around with it and see, the what the different solutions look like. There's also the World Scientists Warning into Action. There was a group of scientists. This was also published in 2021. 15 world scientists writing about 6 urgent areas related to addressing climate change. So they look at energy, atmospheric pollutants, nature, food, population, and the economy. So that's just a nice paper to sort of see how it all, because it's not just, oh, just do something about population and climate change goes away by any means, but it's one of the important contributors to solutions for climate change. And just if anybody's sort of interested in the topic of, the sort of how population links to climate change, the colleague that I was talking about, I mean, I wrote a paper, sort of a paper that's more of for a general audience to really understand how population matters, how population trends matter for climate change. And I guess it's sort of a bit of a primer for those of us who are not like climate scientists, because oh my goodness, when they would start talking, I'd be like, what? What's that? What's that again? So it's just sort of lays it out in general terms. And so I would say those are probably some good resources.
Right now, you're speaking to passionate students who want to actually solve problems like these. What top 3 skills should they study so that they actually have the ability to do so?
Oh my goodness. I would say, and gosh, I always say this, do what you really like doing. If you're really into the numbers, study demography, statistics, big data. There's census data. There's just so much demographic data that you could be looking at. And do you like to know the system and how to make changes? Do some public policy, learn some public policy, because I think the thing that I've really found is it's one thing to have the science on your side and to be able to, talk about the science, but it's a whole nother thing to understand the system in which decisions are made about that science. So I've been really interested in learning about the UN Convention Framework on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and how these meetings work and how decisions are made. So study public policy if that's what you're really interested in, and knowing how to advocate for change. Study advocacy techniques, digital media. There are just so many ways. You could get involved in the modeling, you could get involved in the policy, get involved in the health aspects. There's always a need to do more to advance, reproductive rights, reproductive health, and, to ensure women's autonomy and empowerment. So that's a whole nother area. So gosh, there's just so many things that you could study, but again, just base it on what you love to do, I would say.
Any final recommendations for the audience?
Oh my goodness, get involved. I don't know. It feels like, when I got involved 15 years ago, and saw some of the science and the predictions of some of the things that we're going through, the heat wave that our country is going through right now in the US, the flooding, the droughts, it's all been predicted. But it feels like now is the time that people really need to sort of pay attention and, advocate for change, do whatever we can. One of the really interesting statistics is that the carbon footprint of an additional child in high income countries is huge in comparison to, almost anything else that we can do, recycling, driving electric cars, getting rid of cars. So that's not to say don't have children. It really is not. That's not but just to, just to sort of be aware and think about, making sure that the children that people do have are wanted children, and, and again, which gets back to, women's autonomy and, all of that. So It's a huge area. There's just so much to do. So pick your passion and dive in, I would say.
We heard Karen discuss the scientists' projections for population growth. To concise population further, imagine you're designing a sustainable city that accommodates projected population growth while minimizing carbon emissions. Sketch or describe the city layout, transportation systems, and green spaces that promote climate resilience.
Thank you for taking the How to Solve Climate Change course. If you want to learn the skills to solve this global challenge, join us for free at plato.university for exclusive content, extra resources, and actionable exercises with every lesson. This course was produced by Plato University, where students turn passions into purpose and learn skills to change the world. Learn more at plato.university.